I've long held that the world's largest archive of queer history is the history of art, because language required you to use words that had very particular meanings and were often policed by law, whereas art, you could represent something and you could thereby speak out of both sides of your mouth. Some people, it would be clearly queer. Other people would not get that intent.
Johnathan David Katz, you went region by region around the world, delving into their art history from a queer perspective.
One of the things that you quickly discover when you go outside of the Euro-American context is that most of the world had no problem with homosexuality and represented it freely in their arts. Prussia was one of the states in Germany, but Prussia was the big guns, and they overran all the others, and their law, which was homophobic, superseded the law of other parts of Germany, which was much more open and accepting. Islam celebrated same-sex love. The first love poem written in Arabic to a woman produced a scandal because love poetry was supposed to be written to beautiful boys. Samurai culture was a queer culture. When Japan was finally invaded by the United States and forced open to the Western world, one of the very first laws that they put on the books was to actually end the long tolerance towards homosexuality.
And we still continue to colonize them because the right-wing religious elements here are sending money and people over to Uganda and other places like that to make sure that they don't deviate from this line of anti-gay. This is Mike Balaban with my latest podcast interview. Today, my guest is Johnathan David Katz, a renowned queer art curator who I've been hearing about for some time, but recently a lot more. And I was lucky enough to see your exhibit in Chicago, which prompted me to want to make sure I got you on an interview like today. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So a lot of your work surrounds the whole queer identity. And this most recent exhibit, which you'll talk about at some length, really focused on the origins of that conception of identity. So let me just ask you first, who coined the word homosexual and when did that happen?
So it was coined actually by a guy by the name of Karl Maria Kerbeni, who was a Hungarian journalist. And he coined it in opposition to the then extant language that was brand new, being promulgated by a German jurist by the name of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. Ulrichs believed in what he called Uranians, and he essentially argued that they were a third sex, neither fully male nor female, but rather the female soul in a male body if you were a homosexual man, or a male soul in a female body if you were a lesbian. And Ulrichs, curiously, found actually adherence to this. There were cults of Uranians, but Kerbeni rather presciently recognized that if you were to create a minority identity, it wasn't necessarily the smartest political move, because minorities tend not to actually win civil rights based on their minority status. They're usually screwed. So he instead argued that everybody has the capacity for same-sex relationships, homosexuality, different sex relationships, heterosexuality, and then what he called monosexuality, which was masturbation. And he said, these are universals. And what we've done is something really interesting. We've taken the minoritizing discourse that Ulrichs created, which talked about a sort of specific community, and we've mapped the language of universality onto that. So we screwed them both, and are completely wrong historically, but that's the world.
And then, of course, around the time that happened, Prussia invaded Germany, and it interrupted the whole evolution of that concept.
Right. Well, what happened is that, of course, Prussia was one of the states in Germany, but Prussia was the big guns, and they overran all the other states and unified Germany. And their law, which was homophobic, superseded the law of other parts of Germany, which was actually much more open and accepting. And Germany became essentially the same as Prussia.
So let me ask you, I know from a previous interview, you kind of explained how you got into this business and the barriers you've encountered along the way, starting right from grad school and culminating even in trying to get this most recent exhibit mounted. Can you talk a little bit about that journey and also the opposition?
Sure. I mean, it has been rough. So I entered graduate school in 1980, and with the intent of doing an art history PhD on the relationship between two very, very important American artists, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, who were lovers. And the thesis of the dissertation was that their paintings are kind of love letters back and forth to one another. And long story short, I got thrown out of three different graduate schools for doing that. The University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and then I wasn't thrown out of Yale. I was in a joint PhD and JD program, a law degree program at Yale, and realized that I just did not want to be a lawyer. And so I dropped out of my own accord out of that. But I finished finally at Northwestern University. And I'm proud to say that I did this in the midst of Reaganism, and the general cultural environment around queer issues was pretty backwards. But that only sort of steeled my resolve to do it. And it was rough. And so my first job was actually in San Francisco, at City College of San Francisco, where I became the chair of a brand new program called Gay and Lesbian Studies, which was actually the first gay and lesbian studies program in the United States.
In art or in general?
In general, in general. And I ran that program in San Francisco for 10 years, until I got a phone call to move to, well, first City University of New York, Stony Brook, and then to Yale, where I taught and set up a queer studies program. But at every point, this is now what I've now set up. I'm jumping ahead, but I've set up now 4 queer studies in art history programs, and each time they've been dissolved at one point or another when a new dean or a new provost comes in, because let's not kid ourselves, we still rely on the kindness of strangers, right? The no matter how successful the program was, in the case of my most recent position before my current position, which is at the University of Pennsylvania, I was at State University Buffalo, New York State University Buffalo, and a new dean came and basically said, "You're a boutique program in this fiscal environment. We don't have time for boutique programs." And I pointed out, which was true, that we were self-sustaining. We raised a great deal of money, and we were the top-ranked program in the university. But that did not matter, which told me that it wasn't about money, actually.
Is my understanding that the State University of Buffalo had a large trans focus, or is that some other place that
it did have trans scholarship, and we had several trans scholars there. But again, it became hostile. Yale became hostile. So I set up the queer studies program at Yale. It became hostile. At every turn, the institutional matrix is such that, while you serve the greater needs of the university, you're cool. The minute they sense that you might be a problem, they close you down.
Well, they're very responsive to external threats,
Absolutely.
perceived threats.
Absolutely.
And we get caught in that process.
And the Trump administration, of course, has been the most brutal in its wielding of threat. So, it's really been I mean, from the moment I got kicked out of my first graduate school, from the University of Chicago, where the chair called me into his office and said, if I want to write the dissertation I had proposed, my funding would be cut. But if I chose to choose a different topic, it would be restored. So from that moment to this moment, I can say with some confidence that while things superficially have changed, the fundamental hostility is still there. And I really date much of this to the fight over Robert Mapplethorpe's exhibition, The Perfect Moment, at the Corcoran, which was canceled out of fear of Republican ire. Um, and that has then dogged this field. When I did what was the first major museum queer exhibition in the United States at the National Portrait Gallery called Hide Seek, the Republicans caucused and attacked that show and threatened to pull all the money out of the Smithsonian. And then the Smithsonian director, thinking he was preserving my exhibition, censored one of the works, the David Wojnarowicz video, and thus snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Because what we keep seeing is people kowtowing to this oppressive overlords rather than fighting them. I choose to fight them.
Well, sometimes it's just the perception of it, even as much as the reality. Um, I mean, we can look and see that Harvard has stood up and so far is prevailing. Some of the law firms that chose to fight back aren't being punished. So if we were only to do all of that together, we'd have a hell of a lot more success, but we succumb one by one.
Right. And I've never understood why all the major universities in the United States didn't form a block and tell Trump to fuck off, but they didn't.
Yep. So before we get into the most recent exhibit, which it deserves an hour by itself, do you want to just the interview I saw you do earlier with a mutual friend of ours? You were like involved with like 3 or 4 or 5 exhibits at once, including this multi-year gargantuan one that came out this summer. Do you want to just talk about a sampling of some of the kinds of things you've done over the couple of decades where you've been pretty much focused on this?
Sure. So, I mean, what I ought to mention is that, my day job is as a professor of art history. And then I moonlight doing exhibitions, but I do about 3 a year. And they're always queer focused. So I did one, for example, called About Face, that looked at contemporary trans identity in art and the relationship between queer and trans, which is also a focus historically of the first homosexuals. I've done, as I mentioned, the first major museum queer exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian. And then I've done a number of exhibitions of individual artists. But my goal is to essentially make it safe to address questions of sexuality in the museum world, because I find it really bizarre and perverse that a recent study indicated that more people learn and hear about sexual difference in the context of professional sports than they do in the context of the American Museum. And that is, I think, damning.
Well, it tells you something about the focus of our national body electric, our body politic, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does,
Yeah.
certainly does.
And that we couldn't introduce art into the sports world.
Exactly. And, one of the results of all of this is that when I tried to circulate the exhibition that you were referencing, The First Homosexuals, which I tried to do for 3 years, I could not find a domestic museum willing to take it other than Wrightwood 659 in Chicago, and a much smaller iteration of the show, which will be opening at the Kunstmuseum Basel during Art Basel and for several months before and after. Now, let's be clear. it's a massive show. It was an incredibly expensive show to put together, but my funder actually had agreed to cover the costs of sending it to several big encyclopedic national museums, all of whom turned it down.
because of their fears about what that would lead to.
I can't, I can't speculate because I don't know. All I know is there's a consistent pattern that when it comes to queer exhibitions, we're told no.
Don't you feel, again, there's no way to know this, but don't you feel like if this happened during the early part of the Biden administration, that the overarching reaction of the community you wanted to show this with would have been less poisoned?
Well, the funny thing is that I was shopping this show during the Biden administration, long before Trump's reared his ugly head again. So, I think it's the art world really severed from the larger political context. And I found it very curious that it was European as well as American museums that said no. I mean, we offered the show to the Tate in Britain for free. Um, a massive exhibition would have cost millions of dollars to send it, and it was going to be absolutely free, and they turned it down.
And they would have gotten an immense amount of publicity and interest.
So I believe, but you know, museums, of course, are complicated places. They have their own curators, and their curators always are fighting for time to show their pet projects. So it's always difficult when you come in as an external curator. But I would have thought at least one institution would take the show and
So let's address that. What gave you the idea to mount this exhibition? I mean, you have an extensive involvement throughout your career with a lot of different national and transnational art projects with a queer focus. Did you know this was going to be as massive as it turned out to be? And what gave you the idea?
I didn't know it was going to be as massive, but as I got into it, of course, it became clear that if we were going to do an international show, which is what this is, that we needed to expand on the idea, because one of the things that you quickly discover when you go outside of the Euro-American context is that most of the world had no problem with homosexuality and represented it freely in their arts, and curiously, often represented it and heterosexuality together, not in opposition, but as part of human sexuality. That just like Kerbeni said, that humans have a capacity for homosexual and heterosexual relationships. And so, what we found is the more afield from Europe we got, the more material we were able to find. Um, and so, for example, there's a Japanese scroll in the show that talks about the sexual education of a young man, and half the scroll has him bottoming to men, and the other half has him topping women. And it's not unusual in Japan. It's utterly the norm. And yet, tellingly, when Japan was finally invaded by the United States and forced open to the Western world, they quickly realized that in this new environment, you were either going to eat or get eaten, which is to say, to be colonized or colonize others. They chose to colonize others. And one of the very first laws that they put on the books was to actually end the long tolerance towards homosexuality. Not because they had a problem with it, they had been queer for thousands of years. Samurai culture was a queer culture. But because they felt that the Western nations demanded.
What really astounded me was you went region by region around the world, delving into their art history from a queer perspective, and found in many cases almost the same thing going on at the same time, disconnected from each other.
Yes, yes. I mean, one of the things that I think needs to be underscored is that had colonialism not generalized European bizarre attitudes towards sexuality across the globe, we'd be in a very different place. Um, you know, uh, Islam, for example, celebrated same-sex love. Um, the first love poem written in Arabic to a woman produced a scandal in the mid 1700s because love poetry was supposed to be written to beautiful boys. Um, and uh, and there's a ton of work from Iran historically that show at every level of society men in love with other men or with boys. Um, that was the norm. But with colonialism, right, we remade those societies in our fucked up image. And as a consequence, they're now among the most homophobic places on earth.
And we still continue to colonize them because the right-wing religious elements here are sending money and people over to Uganda and other places like that to make sure that they don't deviate from this line of anti-gay.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And one of the things that was so striking to us was that and it was in the exhibition, that the one exception to this was paradoxically Lima, Peru in the 1830s, where among other images in the exhibition, there's one particular drawing that I love, and it shows on one side a friar, a member of a religious order, on the other side a student in parade dress, looking very aristocratic, which indeed he was. This was reserved for the upper class, and in the middle, a mixed race individual wearing women's clothing, chatting to them both. And this is dated 1830. You would not see this anywhere else in the world, not only because you've got such a flaming fag, right, talking to two authoritative members of society, the church and the upper crust, but also because they are addressing him socially as an equal, which in other parts of the world they wouldn't have given him the time of day. So you really have in Lima a kind of curious bubble that is quite distinct. And newspaper stories in Spain kept sort of worrying over the Lima problem, um, coming to the belief that, the combination of climate, the racial mixing of African Americans, indigenous, and Spanish produced a weak moral will, et cetera, et cetera. You know where this is going. But one of the things that happened, which they didn't count on, was that a number of Spaniards and others read that account and thought, oh, Lima, that's where I need to go. So the population actually grew.
Kind of like San Francisco in the 60s and 70s here.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
If I understand correctly, many, if not most of the works in the show had not been previously lent to other institutions or traveled outside their home countries. How were you able to persuade them to give permission for these works to travel to your exhibit?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that what you're seeing is but the tip of the iceberg of what was there. This is the only show I've ever done in which I had about a 90% rejection rate. And even to the point where in several cases, works that were actually promised to us and transport had already been arranged and paid for, those works were then pulled because, for example, in Slovakia, a change towards a Trump-like regime killed the loans. Notably, the director and the curatorial staff and most of the staff of the National Museum in Slovakia actually quit in protest, which I think is really inspiring. But
And you kind of emphasized that, if I recall, by putting up a replica of the exhibit that was supposed to have been there in person, but was being denied.
um, and the sad fact is that, again and again, there were whole weeks where all I was doing was opening up rejection letters. that the exhibition is so rich, despite 90% rejection, tells you how much material is out there.
Wow.
And I could have done, you know, as a curator, you're always thinking about what escaped you, right? I could have done a much better exhibition,
If only.
had I been able to get everything.
So I don't even know if you know the answer to this question. How many discrete items were in the show?
So there were 356 works in the show.
Right.
And that was cut down. We originally had about 420, but we literally couldn't fit it, so we had to cut things. And as it wasn't the usual museum exhibition with lots of space on the walls. It was a pretty densely hung exhibition, but necessary in order to cover the kind of remit it had, which was to be global and to attend to not just homosexuality, but also the way in which transness and queerness have been linked at the hip from the very beginning. I said a while ago that the earliest definition of homosexual was of the third sex, right? Neither fully male nor female. So right from the beginning, then, queer and trans have been linked. And I wanted to show that historically, because people keep talking about trans as if it's something new today, and it's hardly new.
Were there works that you were pleasantly surprised that you were able to borrow?
Yes, absolutely. There's an amazing image by Andreas Andersen of his younger brother, Hendrik Andersen, in bed with a guy by the name of John Briggs Potter, who subsequently was involved in the setting up of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. And Hendrik is 22, thin, blonde, effeminate, clearly queer, right? Potter is bearded, but they've just gotten out of bed. And what's striking is that this is painted not only by Hendrik's brother, but that it is not a domestically scaled picture, that it is over 7 feet wide.
Wow.
And as such, intended for public display. And it's dated 1894.
Were there many whose connection to LGBTQ culture you weren't already aware of and discovered while researching the project?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I cannot claim credit for is the massive amount of scholarship. What happened, and this is one of the functions of working with an institution that supports these kinds of things without question, is that I quickly realized that I couldn't do this show entirely on my own. I just didn't know what the Indonesian queer cultural life was going to be like. So I got permission to bring 23 of the leading queer scholars in these areas, art scholars, across the world together. And for 3 years, those scholars worked with me towards helping me understand their cultures, presenting works for consideration for the exhibition. And those people then ultimately wrote the chapters in the catalog on their respective regions. And my supporter indulgently paid for all of this, which, museums don't do. They don't do these kinds of scholarly projects, but thankfully he did.
Were you part of a group or a body that decided which items to include, or was that solely your purview?
It was solely my purview. And it was done based on as much information as I could garner from others.
So I think viewers may beginning to get an idea of the scale and scope of this collection and event. How long did it take you to put it together?
So about 7 years. The research part, as I suggested, took about 3 years, and then about 4 years in actually literally getting all the works together. And what happened, of course, in the middle of all this was COVID. And so what we did was a first iteration of the exhibition called The Making of the First Homosexuals, because we had that slot at the museum already dedicated. So we quickly put up 100 works just to sort of do a test run of the concept. And it it was very successful. So we thought we had something, and then we began the full-scale exhibition.
The showplace for these arts is a building that to me looked like it had been an elementary school or something. It was a brick 4-story structure that had been totally redone inside. Was it a Japanese architect?
Yeah, in fact, it's Tadao Ando, the leading, probably historically most important Japanese architect in the world, and it was actually a 38 apartment building in Chicago, which the benefactor purchased and renovated into a museum. It has every bell and whistle a curator could possibly want.
It was a stunning layout. It's hard to describe, but it's 4 floors, and you go to the top floor and work your way down through the exhibit chronologically and geographically.
Exactly.
And then the benefactor bought the building next door for like a personal residence. Is that correct?
Well, he actually had lived next door since the 70s.
Oh, okay.
And then
To me, it looked like a concrete fortress, like he was protecting himself from the slings and arrows of the world's reaction to this topic. I know he wants to remain anonymous. Can you tell us whatever you can about him? And I mean, did he come up with the idea? Did you come up with the idea?
I brought it to him, but
Okay.
but he is on the boards of major world museums, and as a benefactor for the Chicago Art Institute, for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And through those experiences, he came to see that progressive museum proposals were not given the light of day, and especially so for queer stuff. And so he decided, because he has the resources, that he was going to build his own museum and make it a challenge to the accepted parameters of American museum.
Do you think that exposure will in any way change what others are doing, or is it a one-off?
I think it will, but only in time. I think the process has to be that he can do these exhibitions, that they do extraordinarily well, and that the sky did not fall. Towards the end of our exhibition, the waiting list for tickets, because we were sold out completely for the run, was over 100 per day. Museums don't normally get that kind of thing. So there's obviously a real hunger for the show. And one of the things that was surprising to me is that people literally traveled from Europe, from Australia, to see the exhibition.
My friend Kevin Jennings was there early on in the run, I guess in May. It ran from like May 2nd to August 2nd in the end, right? And put up something on one of his social media about how amazing it was. And based on that, I called friends and said, "Can I stay with you?" And booked a weekend in Chicago to see it, which I did, and it was amazing. In so doing, I skipped my home San Diego Pride weekend unknowingly, but I've been there many times. It'll still be there next year. So I found it to be exhaustive and exhilarating. I thought that I'd be able to buy the book when I got there. I knew from a fellow art lovers who tried to buy it, there was a 2 or 3 month wait. Lo and behold, it was a 2 or 3 month wait even when you tried to buy it there because the demand had been so great. We should let viewers know that the book is available through Phaidon Press, I believe.
Phaidon Press, yeah.
Phaidon Press, Phaidon, or on Amazon. But there's at least a couple of months backlog before they will be distributed.
Yeah, so the book is currently being reprinted, but the reprint process is in Asia, and books are very heavy, so they're coming by ship, and so it's going to be a couple of months before but there's already a second full run that is almost sold out. So we're even thinking about a third full run.
And they're $75 each, which is not a cheap price to buy a book. But if you love art or love to know what the history of queer art is, there's no better place to find it than here.
And I should say that the book is being the $75 is because my benefactor is putting a lot of money into those books because they cost much more than that to actually produce.
I'm not surprised. The glossy prints throughout the book are amazing. You had several copies there available for people to look at during the exhibition. I wanted to sneak one under my jacket and walk out, but I didn't. Um, so what can you possibly do to follow up such a massive and successful undertaking? What else are you working on in the future? And mind you, I want to remind everyone that you have a full-time job in addition to this.
Well, I'm working on an exhibition that will open next year in the same institution at Wrightwood 659, which is called This Possession in the Americas, which is work by largely indigenous Latin American artists, many of whom are queer, about the various forms of dispossession that they were subject to, both by virtue of culture, but also by virtue of gender and sexuality. That will open in April.
This is across in Americas entirely, or
It's mostly Latin America.
okay,
So from Mexico south.
right.
Puerto Rico is included. Um, and then I have another show that I'm working on the work of a fascinating Texas artist who is not well known by the name of Jim McGee, working on the book as well. Jim was a remarkable figure. He passed away this year, who pretty much alone built a huge, truly amazing earthwork land art structure in the desert outside of El Paso, Texas, that is both a kind of almost religious shrine, but also contains the ashes of lovers who died of AIDS. It's a very beautiful, complicated thing. And Jim also had various artistic persona who were male and female, current and historical, and he worked in all these different guises. So we're hoping to bring his work to a broader public.
So also go to Wrightwood 659 or elsewhere.
That's probably going to go elsewhere. Yeah.
And it's an homage to all of his work, basically.
It's bringing together for the first time all of his personae and all of his different, and they are very different works, trying to get a bead on the man.
You know, when just thinking about the larger rubric of LGBT themed or sub-themed art, there's such a broad perspective. There are all these people. I remember you telling our friend Patrick Stillman about, I believe it was a trans painter that you have a lot of work by. But having you describe the various individuals who arrange across the spectrum of it, it made, and then you're looking at all the historical art that's been out there for centuries, like Thomas Eakins, or I'm forgetting the name of the guy who did the Arrow shirt ads.
Yes, Leyendecker.
James Leyendecker, that there are all these things that have been sitting there staring us in the face. And we as LGBTQ people recognize the homoerotic underlying aspect. When you see a Leyendecker painting, it just appeals to you as a gay man, right?
Right.
And I have been carrying around an image of Thomas Eakins' The Swimming Hole for decades, not realizing, yeah, he was gay, and that was about as close as you could get to admitting it. In fact, I took a photo of what I would call a swimming hole, but really it's a cove and a beach in Ibiza in 1985 that I had no idea would effectively be an homage to The Swimming Hole by Thomas Eakins.
Yeah.
Because it's a universal theme.
right,
naked people swimming, right?
right. And of course, what made him such a fascinating figure is that he actually intended that painting. He painted it for one of his patrons, who is the head of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, who wanted to give it to his wife for her birthday. And the letter that he writes to Akins in which he rejects the painting is really sweet because he's like, you know, I really wanted my wife to like this. I'm just not sure an image of naked men would. That's really funny.
Right.
And it tells us something about Akins's lack of inhibition. He just didn't care.
Again, I mean, I'm forgetting who does this, but on Instagram there's a page called Breaking the Code, and he takes a look at all these things which are there in plain view of all of us.
Yeah.
And those of us who are gay often caught the intended subtext, but most of the world didn't. And so he's kind of helping everyone understand what was really going on. So that's really what you do and all of the art curators do. Is
Right.
with new art or old art, is bring it to the attention of a broader world and try to explain it.
Well, and in fact, I've long held that the world's largest archive of queer history is the history of art. Because language required you to use words that had very particular meanings and were often policed by law. Whereas art, you could represent something and you could thereby speak out of both sides of your mouth.
Right.
Some people, it would be clearly queer. Other people would not get that intent. So
Well, the opaqueness made it acceptable.
exactly right. Exactly right. And so the vast bulk of the works in the exhibition are this kind of coded work that, you wouldn't necessarily pick up. I'll just give one example. There's a work by a straight artist, actually, named Danyan Bouveret, of two men, Gustave Courtois and his lover, von Stetten, walking arm in arm along the Seine. It's actually the first work we know of a real-life same-sex couple depicted in Western art. Courtois and von Stetten were together for many, many decades, and the painter, Danyan Bouveret, was a friend of theirs, though he was straight, and he represents them. And the question I had in looking at that picture was, are we supposed to pick up that this is a gay couple? And what's interesting about the picture is that it's not referencing them. They're in the background. It's actually referencing the figure in the foreground who's a laundress. And the
I've
question,
seen that.
right? Why is there a laundress in the foreground of the picture? Well, France had a curious law that sex work was legal, but solicitation for sex work was not. So the code that developed in the 19th century was that you were a laundress. And if you were out in public with bags of laundry, it probably meant you were a working girl. And that working girl is not looking at these prospective clients. She's looking at us with a disdainful expression. So what he is saying is they are a gay couple.
It's really multiple themes conveyed in one image.
Absolutely.
But
And so many of the images are rich that way. But, it's also complicated, like the figure that you mentioned, Elisarion, who built a temple to male love. He believed actually that there was only one gender, that we were all of the same gender. It was a perversion of divine will that we were divided into sexes. And he was very proud of his wide hips and his ample breasts. And he was a follower of Hitler.
Oh my God.
So, history isn't what we want it to be. It is what it is.
There's just no explaining. It's like how there's so many right-wing gay men. It's like shooting yourself in the face, but they do it anyway.
They do it anyway. Yeah.
Well, this has been really informative, and it's wonderful to have the chance to sit with you like this one-on-one. I can't wait to see what you've got coming next, and of course, to receive the book in due course. Thanks again.
A pleasure.